So you
You know nothing about
HTML or CSS.
CSS and want
to
to
learn everything
from scratch.
So in the first
Part of this series,
you're going to talk about
the fundamentals
of web development
with HTML.
and CSS.
In the second
Part, we'll explore
explore the advanced concepts.
concepts.
And in the third part,
We'll put
everything together,
and build a
beautiful,
responsive and
blazingly fast
website. If you're
new here, be sure
to
to
subscribe as
upload new videos.
all the time.
Now let's
Jump in and
get
get
started. Alright, let's
talk about the tools
you
you
need to take this course.
For-
For the starter,
you need a code.
editor.
There's so many
Code
code
editors out there,
like Visual
Studio Code or
VS Code,
Sublime Text,
Atom.
and so on.
In this course, I'm
I'm
going
going to use VS Code,
along with
a few extensions,
for start
starting a web server,
and form.
formatting our code.
You're welcome to
Use your favorite code
editor if
to
you
know what you're doing.
but otherwise
Otherwise, head over to
to code.visual.com
visualstudio.com,
and download
download the latest version
of VS Code. Now here inside
of VS Code. We're going to
install a couple
install extensions.
so
Let's open
the extensions panel
the
and search
for,
Prettier.
here's the extension we're going to
Install
Prettier Code.
Formatter.
With this extension,
We can
format our code.
and make it pretty.
This is a very
Very popular extension.
extension.
As
As
you can see, it's
it's been downloaded
more than 9 million.
times.
So over
Over here, you're going to have,
an install button
just click it,
and you're done. Next, we're going to install
another
another extension called
called Live
Live Server.
Server.
With this, we
We can launch our website
site inside
at development.
web server.
Again, this is a very
Very popular extension.
extension. It's been
Been downloaded
almost 8 million.
times.
Now,
Now, in addition to these,
These we're going to use
use a browser
to view and test.
our web pages.
Again, you can
Use
use
your favorite browser.
browser, but in this
Of course, I'm going to use
use Google Chrome.
and I
Make
encourage
sure to use the same
browser so you
you can easily follow.
follow the course.
We're going to start
Our
our
web development
journey here.
in every section,
Section, you will learn
something new about
web development.
and by the end of
This
this,
course,
we'll
you'll
put all of this
together to
to build a beautiful.
full web page.
In this section,
We're going to talk
talk about the fundamental
fundamentals of web.
development,
You'll learn
the languages
and tools used
in web development,
as well as the
key concepts
and vocabulary,
such as
URL,
HTTP,
DOM, and so on. We're also going to talk about
about how websites,
its work
so you will understand
and what
exactly happens
under the hood
when you use your browser
browser to visit
or
a.
website,
You will also learn
how to inspect
network traffic
traffic using Chrome,
from dev tools,
which is a very
powerful tool
used by front-end,
and developers.
but also
Also talk about the
basics of HTML
HTML and CSS,
and
validating web pages,
which is something
something a lot of
developers miss.
this is going to
Be
be
an awesome journey.
so let's
Jump in and get
start it.
This course is your
First step towards
becoming a web.
developer.
So let me give you
A
a
simple roadmap
map to know
where you are and
where you should go next.
every
Website has two
parts.
a front end and a back
Backend, browser,
and interact with
all the visual.
visual aspects.
The back
Backend is the part
that powers the front.
front end. It's
Behind the scenes,
and it's mainly about
about storing data
in databases,
and
providing it to the front.
content.
So web development
And jobs fall
fall into three
main categories.
front end,
Front development,
back end development,
and
full stack development,
which involves
both front end
and back-end
development.
Front-end developers,
Developers use
HTML,
CSS and
JavaScript to
build
build
front ends.
back-end
Developers have
different sets of
tools available
to
to
them, which is
outside
the
the
scope of this course.
course. So
Let's talk about the HTML,
HTML, CSS,
CSS, and Java.
JavaScript
HTML,
is short for
hypertext.
markup language.
I know it's a,
Mouthful.
but basically we use
HTML to
define the
building blocks
of our web pages.
CSS
CSS is short for
for cascading
style sheet,
and is used for
styling web pages
and making them.
beautiful.
JavaScript
Is used for adding
adding functionality.
to web pages.
Let me give you
An analogy.
think of a
Building.
building in the real world
Word is like a
web
web
page on the internet.
internet.
It has a skeleton,
Or structure.
It
It
can
can have pretty walls
windows,
and tiles.
and it can
Have
have
certain functionality.
For example,
Example, when we
press the elevator,
press a button,
it comes to pick up.
this up.
Here's a real example.
Example,
Let's say you want to build a
website like so
so JavaScript
is a programming language,
language
while HTML
and CSS are
not, meaning
we cannot use
use them to tell computers.
computers what to do.
We use
We
them
want to define the
building blocks of
our web pages.
and style them,
Every web
which
page
you have seen on our internet
internet is built
with these three.
languages.
So the better you
You learn and understand
understand these languages,
their features.
the better
You will be at front end.
and development.
So your front
Front-end development journey,
learning starts with
HTML and
CSS.
I would say
If you spend
3 to 5
hours every day
days studying and
coding,
You should be able to have
a
a
reasonable
understanding of these two
languages
in about a month
or a month and
and
a
a
half.
half.
Once you learn these languages,
Languages, then
you need to learn JavaScript.
JavaScript.
I have a separate series
Series for learning JavaScript.
JavaScript.
So after
Finishing this series,
you may want to enroll.
in that series,
I would say
learning JavaScript
JavaScript would probably
probably take
another 6 weeks.
of your time.
Of course,
You're not going to be a
JavaScript expert
in just 6 weeks.
but you will have
A
an
reasonable
understanding of it
and you will learn more
more as you work
on different projects.
projects.
So the first 3
Months is all
about the fundamentals. Now,
building websites,
often include a
bunch of repetitive.
tasks.
This is where
Front-end frameworks
frameworks and libraries.
come in,
A framework
or a library
comes with a lot
of code that we can
of reuse in our
websites.
so they help us
Just get the job
done faster.
That's
Why a
A
lot
lot of companies
these days use
one of these popular
other frameworks,
like React
Angular.
or Vue.
Now, technically,
React is
it's not a framework,
it's a library.
but subtle.
The synchronous side
All these tools
serve
the
the
same purpose:
they help us
build applications.
faster.
Now, you
You
don't
need to learn
need
all
all of these to get started. Different companies use
different tools
for different projects.
So
As you move from one
one project to
to
another
another, you may want
to learn about the other.
tools.
If you're starting out,
Out just
focus on React,
because it's the most
most popular
tool in this space.
Once
Once you learn React,
you can always
just learn the other tools.
tools if needed.
For React,
You would
you
probably
will need 1
to 2 months.
again
Have a comprehensive
course on React.
React. More than
40,000
people have taken this.
this course and loved it.
Right, what's the next step?
Version
Control systems.
we use
The
a
version control
system to keep
keep track of our
project history
and work collaboratively.
collaboratively with others.
There
There are many version control
are systems out there,
like Git,
Subversion,
Mercurial,
and so on.
but Git
Is the most
popular tool in this
space
and is used in more
than
than
70%
of software.
companies.
That's why you'll
See
see
it in almost
every job description.
description.
I would say
You
you
would probably need
2 weeks for learning.
learning Git.
And again,
I have a comprehensive.
of course for you.
So these
These are
are
the essential skills
skills that every
front-end developer.
must have.
You'll see these listed
Listed on almost
every job.
description.
Now,
Different jobs
require other skills.
skills, but
These skills vary
from one company,
to another.
so you can learn
These additional
things in the future.
or on the job.
For
Now, just
focus on these
4 skills.
or 4 steps.
Remember,
Less is more.
more.
Don't try to learn too much.
Many things quickly.
You won't learn it.
Anything. You'll just.
Just waste your time.
All right.
That's your roadmap.
Next, we're going to talk
Talk about
how the web works.
have you ever wondered
How the web works.
in this
Lesson, I'm going to
tell you exactly
tell you what happens
the moment
if you type the
address of a website
site into your browser,
and hit
enter.
as part of this
We're going to talk about
about a few
important concepts
and terms that
you need to know.
as a web developer.
So let's
We
say
will launch our
browser and head
head over to a website
site like code with
launch.com.
Now this
Address that we have in the
browser address
bar is called a
URL, which
which is short for
uniform
Resource Locator.
basically
Basically, it's a way to
locate a resource.
source on the internet.
Resources
It can be web pages
also
called HTML.
HTML documents,
They can be
images,
video files.
fonts, and so on.
So
we type the URL
Of a website
and
and
hit enter.
what happens then?
Now, well,
There are two
2 pieces involved
here.
The browser
so
also
called the client,
and the
computer, or
computers
that host our
target website.
we refer
To
to
these as web
servers or
servers for short.
this is what
We call the client.
server model.
The client
Requests a
service
the server provides
is the service.
so our
Browser sends a
message to the server.
and says,
Hey, give me
the
the
homepage of
this
this.
website.
This is kind of
Similar to
how you send your friend
send a text message.
message. You can think
Think of your phone as
as the client
sending the message,
and your friend's
friend's phone as
the server.
receiving the message.
Now,
Like for example,
this message is
is formatted
based on a
protocol called
HTTP
or hypertransfer
text transfer.
protocol.
You've
Probably noticed it
before, but never.
I knew what it is.
In simple
Simple terms, a
HTTP is a
language that clients
and servers use
use to talk to
each other.
It's not a programming,
Language,
it's just a plain
textual language
language for communicating
communicating over the internet.
We
We also have HTTP,
PS, which is
HTTP with
with encryption.
so the message
Messages exchanged
between the client
and the server are
encrypted.
here's a simple
Simplified example of
an HTTP message.
message. With this
Message, the
browser tells
the server what
what it's looking for.
So-
So on the first line, it
says that it
wants to get
a page or
a file called
index.html
HTML
using HTTP
HTTP version 1.
1.1.
Index.html
HTML often
often represents the
homepage of website.
websites.
On the second line, we
We can see the host,
that is code with
mosh.com.
and on the third line,
Line, we can see
see the language that
the client can
accept. In this
case English. Now don't worry about
memorizing any of this.
this. All I
Want you to understand
here is that
this message is
structured
based on the
HTTP protocol
protocol that clients
and servers
understand.
So the
Server receives this message,
message, it
figures out what the
client is asking,
and then
it will send a message
message back to the
client.
The first message is
Called an HTTP,
HTTP request.
and the
Second message is
called an HTTP.
HTTP response.
Every
The
data
exchange using
using the HTTP
protocol
involves two messages,
a request
request and a response.
response.
Now, what is in
The
the?
response.
Here's a simple.
For example,
On the first
first line, we see
the
the
version of HTTP
HTTP protocol
used, followed
followed by a number
which is the status.
code.
200 means
Successful or
okay.
right
Below
below,
that, we can see
see the date and
the time of the response.
response,
Next, we can see the
type of content
the server is
sending back to the
client. In this
case, text,
text/,
HTML.
and
After that, we
you
can
can see the HTML
code or the HTML
HTML document,
that represents
the homepage
of code with Mosh.
.com.
Of course, the
Actual HTML
code
code.
is way longer.
Now,
As the browser
so reads this HTML.
HTML document
It constructs
constructs what we call
a DOM
or a document
object.
model.
Don't let this fancy
Name scare you.
This is a model
Model that
represents the
objects or
elements
in our HTML.
document.
What are these
Elements,
all the building blocks
of
of
our page, like
paragraphs of text,
text, images,
images, links
and other stuff.
You
You'll
will
see this in action.
in the next lesson. Now, as the
Browser is reading
in this HTML
document that is
returned from the server
server. It
discovers
references to other
resources in this
document,
like images
fonts.
and other stuff.
Each of these
These resources
has an address.
or a URL.
So for each,
Each resource
the browser sends
sends a separate
HTTP
request to the server
request to fetch that.
that resource.
Many of these
HTTP requests
are sent
in
in
parallel
so we can see the page
page as quickly
as possible.
once the
Browser has all
the necessary
resources,
it will render the
HTML document.
document.
Rendering an HTML
Document means
displaying it.
it's a fancy
Technical term we use.
often.
So in a nutshell,
Shell our
browser sends
an HTTP
request to the server
request and receives
and HTTP.
HTTP response.
This HTTP
HTTP response
contains an HTML.
HTML document.
The browser
Reads that HTML
document
to construct
a document
object model
and render the page.
page.
In the next lesson,
I'm going to show you all
all of these steps in
action. All right, let's see
HTTP requests
and responses
in
in.
action.
So open up
Chrome and
head over to Google.
help.com.
Now we need to access
Access Chrome Dev.
tools.
This is a very powerful
Tool used by
front-end developer.
developers.
So on the top,
We go to View, Developer, Developer Tools.
now look at the
Shortcut,
on Mac,
Alt or Option,
Command,
Command, and I.
on Windows,
It's obvious
different
but remember the shortcut
cut because it's
much faster.
to access the Dev
DevTools via the key.
keyboard.
So
Here's
the DevTools.
the first time you see
See it, it might appear
it, a bit intimidating.
but trust
Me, it's much easier
than you think.
throughout the course
You're going to learn
more
more.
about the DevTools.
So
Here we
have
have
a few different tabs,
elements,
console,
sources, network.
network, and so on.
In this,
Demo
you're going to go to the network
tab. So
we can inspect the
network traffic
to
and from Google.
google.com.
Now by
Default, Dev
DevTools is
dock to the bottom.
of the screen.
We can dock it
To the left
to the right
or undock it
as a separate window.
window.
So over here, we can
Dock it to the left side. A lot of front
front-end developers like,
this layout.
so they put
DevTools on the left
side
and they have their
website on the right side.
Yeah.
And this demo,
I'm going to undock
it as a separate
window
so we have more space
to
to.
work with.
So
This one.
dock it
Good. Now we need to refresh.
to our website.
As you can see,
Over here on
Mac we can press
Command and R.
on Windows,
Windows is probably
Control and R.
R.
Alternatively,
We can go
back
back
to this window,
and press
the refresh button. Now,
back to the DevTools.
look at all
All these items over here.
here.
These are the HTTP
Requests that
that are sent from our
browser to Google.
google.com.
As
You
you can
can see
they're totally
the
45
requests.
and
Here's the amount of data
dot transferred
over the network.
network. So
In this case,
just over 94.
4 kilobytes.
Now look at
The first item in
this list.
this is the first
HTTP request.
request that
Chrome sent to Google.
google.com.
As you
You can see
with this request,
request the browser
browser wanted to
get a
document
and
the status of this
request is
200
which means okay.
Okay.
Over here you can see the
amount of data
transferred over
for the network for this
request,
and
the time it took
to get the response.
response.
Now if we click on this,
This request,
we can see more.
more details about it.
So
Here on the headers tab,
we can see all
all the headers of
of our request.
a response.
So
Here are some general
headers like
request URL,
request
method, which is
get,
status code.
that is 200,
We talked about it.
remote
Address,
This is the new
make representation
of Google.
.com.
Now down
Below we have
response.
headers. There's
So many headers here, you
you don't
don't
have to worry about
them. But
as an example,
look at content.
content type
We talked about this
in
in
the previous lesson.
so the type of
This response
is text
/HTML.
ML.
Below that,
We have the date
date and time of the
response.
Now if we click
Click on the preview tab. We can see a preview
view of the HTML
document
that is returned from the
server
So this is the home
homepage.
of Google.
Now this
HTML document
we have references
to other
resources,
like images,
fonts, and so
so
on.
on.
So all these
Subsequent requests
requests are
sent to
download those resources.
resources.
So right below the
First request,
we have a request
for
downloading
a PNG or
an
an
image file.
here's
Another request
for getting another
image
You have two requests,
for getting two different.
different fonts and so on.
Now
We can easily filter.
Filter this list.
So
Let's click on the
filter icon here.
Yeah.
By default, we see
all requests.
but we can
Filter by request.
type.
For example, we
We can select doc
to see requests
for downloading
loading HTML
documents
or font,
to see
the request
that were sent to download.
with fonts and so on.
Next,
Next, I'm going to show you
how to create your
first HTML.
document.
All right, first
Things first,
here on your desktop
or anywhere,
or on your computer,
right click
click and create
a new folder. I'm going to call this
HTML, but we could
call it anything. Now, let's go back
back to VS Code
and
open the Explorer
to our panel.
Then
we go to open
folder
and
open the folder.
that we just created.
Good.
Good.
Now this folder is
Currently empty.
so let's add
Add a new file
here called
index.html.
.html. As I told you before,
Index that
HTML of
often represents
the homepage of web.
websites.
So
Let's go with that.
Now-
Now we can close the
Explorer panel by
pressing Command
and B on
Mac or
Control and B on.
on Windows.
Good.
Now,
The first thing we need
to do here,
is to tell the
browser that
that this is an HTML
HTML5.
document.
So we type
Type a left
angle bracket. Now look at this suggestion.
list.
The first item here,
Is doc type,
type or
document type.
let's press
Enter or tab. VS Code
generated this piece of.
code for us.
So with this
Line of code,
we
which
can tell browser
is that this is
on HTML5.
5 document.
This line of
Code here is called
doc type.
type declaration.
In the
Previous versions of
HTML, our
doc type declaration
declaration was so
long, it was
so messy.
but HTML
5 solved this problem.
problem.
So all we have to type
Is doc
type HTML.
HTML.
And by the way,
HTML is
not a case sensitive.
the language which
Means it's not
sensitive to
uppercase and lower,
uppercase letters.
but
Conventionally speaking,
we type
everything in lowercase
case except
doc
type. This is
is
just
a convention.
we could type
This in lowercase
and that's perfect.
define.
So let's revert.
Sit back.
Now
Right after this,
this we need
to use our HTML
elements
to define the
structure of this.
web page.
The first
Element we're going to use
is the HTML.
HTML element.
So we type
HTML,
and then press
tab or enter. Once again,
VS Code generate
created this piece of code.
code for us.
So
What
what
we have here on the left side,
side is called
the opening tag, and
what we have on the right side.
it is the closing tag.
Tag. So
Most HTML
elements have an
opening and a closing,
closing tag.
but there are exceptions
As I'm going to show
you
you
later in this video.
Yeah.
Now, inside this
element, we're going to
add additional.
elements.
Now, because I
I
don't
want to type everything.
in one line
I'm going to press enter.
there.
That's better.
Now here we're going to
Add 2 elements
head.
and body.
So once again, we
Type head,
press tab
good,
and then
body. We use the head element
to give browser
browser information.
about this page.
For
Example, here we can use
Use
the title element to specify
by the type
title of this page
that appears
appears in the browser.
over here.
So let's type
Type my
first.
web page.
Now let's save
The changes by pressing
pressing Command
an S on Mac,
or Control
Control and S on
on Windows.
good.
Now before
Go any further,
let's right
click somewhere and go to open
click with.
live server.
So we're going to open
Open this page
using the development
on the server that
we just installed. Okay. All right.
take a look.
So our page
Page is currently empty.
because we haven't
Added any element
elements inside this
page.
and over here
Here
you can see the title,
that we just typed.
my first.
Web page.
Now look at the
URL or
or address of this.
this page.
We have 127.0.1.
7.0.1.
This
number or this IP
IP address
represents the
local computer,
it's global.
globally known. So
Everybody knows 1.0.0
127.0.0.1
references the current.
and computer.
After that,
We have a colon,
and then
we have
the port number,
number on which
our web
server is listening.
So
Our web server is
waiting for
HTTP requests
on this
port.
Okay.
Then we have a forward slash
file
followed by the name of our
file index
index.html.
back to VS Code.
Inside
Inside the body
element, we're going to
add
elements that would appear.
here on our page.
So let's
Say we want to display it.
tweet
What elements do we need?
it here
An image
and some text element.
element.
So we type
img
short for image,
and then press.
tab. Here's our image element.
Now this
Image element
is different
from the other elements
we have created.
so far.
Can you tell the difference?
Differences,
There are two differences.
differences here
The first difference,
is that here we
we don't have a
closing tag,
we only have
an opening tag.
because the
Image element
cannot have any.
any child element.
That's the reason.
Reason.
Now in the previous version,
Versions of HTML
we used to have
add a
forward slash here.
and
This
this
represents
a self-close.
closing tag.
But we don't have
We
to
do this in HTML.
5,
So I'm going to keep the code.
simpler. Now, here
We
we have
have
two attributes,
attributes
source and
and alt.
with this
The attributes,
we can supply
additional information
addition about an element. So we use the source element
element to
to specify the
path to our image.
So
So let's open up the
Explorer panel
one
one
more time by pressing
pressing Command
and B on Mac,
or Control and B.
B on Windows. Here I'm
I'm going to create a new folder,
folder called
images. Now for this demo
I'm going to use my own.
own image, which
You
you
can also download
can right below this video.
video, but you
You
can
can use any image.
that you want.
So
So here's my image.
I'm going to drop
It
onto
to the images folder. It's right here. Okay.
Now-
Now let's close this.
window.
Good.
So
Where is this image?
relative
If
index.html,
HTML file
it's in
inside the images folder.
folder, right?
So here in the
Double quotes,
we type
images,
slash
mosh.
the JPG.
Now we are
This code is suggesting
using this name, so
we can press tab
tab to
complete the code.
beautiful.
Now
Alt is short
for alternative
text.
and we use this
This attribute
to give the browser
browser some text
to display.
in case the
Image cannot be.
displayed.
We'll talk about this in more.
More detail in the future.
So
So for now, I'm
I'm
going
going to delete this
to
attribute.
attribute. Good.
Now after
The image, we're
we're
going
going to add a text.
to element
So we type P,
that is short
short for paragraph,
tab.
and
Here
here
we can type
my Twitter handle
no. So add
at Mosh.
Hamandani. After that, we're going to add
Add another text
text element. And here we can type
the body.
body of our tweet.
So
I love to
to
teach you HTML.
HTML.
Perfect.
All right, now let's
Let's see how we can use
CSS to
improve the look and
fill out this page.
look
At
at.
our head element,
Currently, we have
have a single element
element inside
inside the head element,
that is
our
our
title element.
right
Now after the
title.
we're going to add
Another element
called.
style.
This is where
We're going to write our
CSS code.
so
In between style,
tags.
we're going to write a bunch
Bunch of CSS
of
rules.
rules.
First, we're going to work
On this
image
code
over here.
here,
We're going to type
img,
to reference our.
our image element.
Then we
We type a
pair of curly braces,
braces.
and
Inside the braces,
we write
one or more
CSS declaration.
declarations.
Each declaration
Contains a
property.
and a value.
So here we can set
Set the width property.
property to
Let's say 1
100 pixels.
So-
we type the property
colon
and then the
value.
and then we terminate
With this line
using a semicolon
colon. So we can
and write multiple
multiple CSS
declarations.
Now let's
Save the changes.
a rule.
Here we're going to set
The
border dash
Radius.
property to
Let's say
say 10 pixels.
Now
Don't worry about memorizing
using any of this property.
properties. We're
We're
going
going to go over them
to several times throughout.
throughout the course.
In this lesson,
I just want you to
get
get
a sense of
what
what
it's like to use CSS.
CSS. Okay?
So-
save the
Change it. If we set border
radius to a
value that is
is half of the
width
we'll get a round.
image,
So
I'm going to set this to
50 pixels.
and
And here's the result.
that's
A
a
lot better.
Now our
Elements are stacked.
vertically
I want the image
to be pushed to the
left side.
So
Let's set
the float
float property.
to left.
This will
Push the image element
to the left
side of our text.
elements.
Take a look.
So
That's a
a lot better.
But our image is so
So close to the text.
I want to
Add some space.
after the
Image
so here we use another
property called
margin
dash.
right.
We can set it to
10 pixels.
Save.
And
That's
a
a lot.
lot better.
Now,
Let's make the username
in bold.
So we're going to repeat.
Repeat one more time.
This time we're going
Now apply a
to rule
to our
paragraph element.
So,
Here
we're
we go.
going to set the
Font that
dash weight property
to
bold. Take a look. See what happened?
both our
Text elements are bold.
bold.
But what if you want to
Apply this style
only to
to
the
username.
well,
We have to
separate these two
paragraph element.
elements.
So I'm going to give the
First paragraph element
element an
attribute called
class.
so
Class equals double quotes.
class is
Short for classification.
and
We can use this
attribute to
put this element
inside
in a different class
or a different category.
category.
Just like the products
In a supermarket.
in a
Supermarket, we have
products in
different categories.
categories, right?
So
I'm going to put this
paragraph element
inside a class
class or inside a
category called
username. And then
I'm
we're
going
going to change this rule. So
this rule is
currently applied to
all paragraph elements,
elements
but I want it to be applied
applied only
to paragraph elements
to with the
username class
So
right after
P
p
we type
dot user.
username.
Now we can
Also remove P.
p.
And this
This rule will apply
apply to all
elements
that have the user,
username class,
whether they're
paragraph elements,
or other types.
types of elements.
Okay.
Now
Save the changes.
take
Take a look. So
that's
a
a
lot better. So this
This is CSS in action.
action.
As you can see,
CSS has a different
different syntax,
or a different
grammar than
HTML.
throughout the rest
So the course,
you're going to learn both
this language is
in detail.
next. I'm going to
Show
show you
you how to
format your code using.
using Prettier. Hey guys, Mosh here.
I just want
To
to
let you know that this
video you've been watching
watching is the first
first hour of
my ultimate
HTML and CSS.
CSS series.
So after you,
Watch this video,
if you want to learn,
more from me,
you can enroll in the full
full course, which is
about 13 hours.
hours long and
Covers everything.
everything you need to know to
Build professional
build quality website
with HTML.
and CSS.
It also
Includes
summary notes,
exercises,
a real
project, a
certificate of
completion you can add to your
resume,
and
and
a 30-day
money back guarantee.
to get a refund
Fund if you're not satisfied.
satisfied.
So you have nothing
To lose and a lot.
to learn. So
If you're interested,
I put the link in the
description box.
One
Thing you need to know about browsers,
browsers is that
they ignore white
spaces in
HTML and
CSS code.
for example,
I can
put all these elements
Comments on a
in
single
a line,
and everything.
it still works.
Let me show you. So
Save the changes
Back.
in the browser,
we have the same
result as before.
because
Browsers
we don't
don't
care how we
format our code.
But
Formatting is very
very important when
it comes to reading
it's and maintaining
code. We
want
want
our code to be
beautiful and
perfectly formatted
just like an article.
article.
This is where we use the
Prettier plugin.
With
Prettier
we can format our
code in a consistent.
consistent fashion.
This is super
Super important when you're
part of a team.
because different people
People have different ways
of
of
formatting their code.
code, but if
Everyone on the team,
uses the Prettier,
your plugin
the code
will be consistent.
perfectly formatted.
So
Let me show you how.
to use Prettier,
On the top,
we go to
the
the
view menu,
look at
the
the
shortcut
for the command panel.
palette.
On Mac, it's
Shift.
Command and P.
On Windows,
It's probably Shift
Control.
and P.
So let's bring
Bring up the command palette.
and
Here
here
we search for
format
that document. Now we press.
enter.
We get this message.
Message saying
There are multiple
formatters for HTML.
HTML files.
Select the default.
Default formatter to
Continue.
The reason we're getting
This message is
that VS
code by
default comes
with a formatter
for formatting
HTML files.
but
We
we
have installed Prettier,
here, which is a separate.
separate formatter.
So
Let's go to configure
here
and tell VS Code
to use
Prettier
to format
HTML and
CSS files. Okay.
Now?
Prettier formatted
my code.
so none of those elements
Elements are
on the same line.
this is a lot.
Better. But
Let me show you a trick.
we don't want to
Format our code.
every time we make it change.
Change.
So we can
Configure VS Code
to automatically
automatically format
the code
the moment we save
the
the.
changes.
So on the top,
Let's go.
go to the code menu,
Then
preferences,
and
settings.
like
Here, search
search for
format and
save. Here's the setting.
let's enable this.
Setting.
Now,
Every time we
save the changes,
VS Code
automatically format
formats our code using
Prettier. Earlier we talked
talked about the DOM
or document
document object model.
model.
I told you that when the
Browser reads the
HTML document
document that is returned.
from the server
It constructs
constructs a document.
document object model.
Now let
Let me
me
show you this document
an object model.
in action.
So
Once again, we're going to use
Chrome DevTools.
The shortcut
on Mac
is Shift.
Command and I.
On
Windows is probably
Shift Control.
and I.
I'm not really sure.
So,
Let's open up the
tools.
Now this
This lesson, we're going to look at
the Elements
tab. Now, what we have here on the
left
left
side is
our document object.
object model.
So, we see the
Same elements
that we created earlier.
in the course.
We have the HTML,
Element, head,
head, body,
and so on.
but we have some
Additional elements
that are injected
by live
server.
For example, we have
The script element
and two.
divs.
Don't worry about these.
These are purely
Used by live server.
server, so it
Automatically reloads our
page.
Now we can hover over
Over,
any of these elements.
and you can see that
Element highlighted.
on the screen.
Now we can click
Click an element, and on the right
side.
you can see the style
As applied to
this element.
So look at
The styles we define
find for the image element
element,
with border.
radius, and so on.
We can
Enable or disable.
disable these styles.
So we can
Disable the width property.
property
And now our image is.
big.
We can bring it back.
Back
We can also change its.
value
So we can set it
to, let's say,
to 50 pixels. Now our image is smaller.
smaller.
We can use the up and
And down arrows to change this value.
this is
Pretty
pretty.
handy.
So a lot of front-end
Developers
use DevTools
to play
with
with
these styles
and get the look they want.
want. Once they
Figure out the exact
styles and
their values,
then they apply.
apply them in the code.
Now
One
one
more
more
thing,
over here
you can see
where these styles
have been applied.
So
In index
HTML,
on line 6,
we can
click on this link.
and
This takes us to the
exact line of code
where
we wrote that style. Now we're currently on the
sources tab.
so
Then go back to elements,
and
inspect other.
elements.
So
This is the basics
of inspecting
elements using DevTools.
tools. We're going to
Talk about this in more
detail in the future. The last thing we're going to cover
cover in this section.
is validation. So as we write,
Code, we may
run into problems.
if you have a
Typo in our code,
or don't use
the right syntax,
for grammar,
our web pages may
not look as expected.
expect it.
In this situation,
We can use
use a validator
to identify
with the potential
errors in our code.
Like-
Currently, we don't have any problems.
problems on this web page.
It looks perfect,
Perfectly fine to me
but let's run it
by the standard
HTML.
validator.
So we go
To validator
to W3
3.org. This is a
standard
markup validation.
validation service.
We have
Three
three
methods for
validating our HTML.
HTML markup.
We can
Validate by an address.
if our website
Website is live,
on our internet
but this doesn't work
work for us.
because our website
Site is currently
hosted locally
in our
development server.
so
This
IP address that we have
have over here,
127.0.1
0.0, this is a
local IP address.
address. So
No one else can
access our website. So here
We
we
have two other methods.
We can
Validate by
file upload or
or by
direct input.
in this case,
So I'm going to go with
file upload. So let's upload
our index
that HTML
file.
and check. So look,
We have one
warning.
and two errors.
The warning
It's saying that
we haven't added the
lang or lang
language attribute
to the HTML.
mel start tag.
This is a
Common best practice.
because
With this, we can tell
search engines
what is the
language of this,
web page.
so they can do a better
Better job at
displaying the result.
results.
This is very easy to fix.
Fix. So
Here's our
HTML tag,
We're going to add
the lang attribute,
attribute and
set it to E,
en, which
is
is
short for English. Now,
what is next? We have an error.
saying the character
Character encoding was.
is not declared.
Don't worry
About
about
this, we'll talk
this in the next section.
section.
So let's look at the.
Second error.
It's saying
With
that
an image element
must have
have an alt.
alt attribute.
So earlier
We had this alt attribute.
attribute, I
Told you that. We use
the alt attribute
attribute to provide
a description
description for our image.
So-
So if the image
will
cannot,
be displayed,
the alternative
text will be displayed.
displayed.
Again, we're going to talk about
The alt attribute
it in more detail in the
future.
So back to our,
Our code
let's fix this error.
real quick.
Here's our image tag.
Tag
Let's add the
the alt attribute
Good.
and for the description
option. I'm going to say
an image
image
of Mosh
Hamadani.
No.
Let's save the changes.
Yes.
Let's re-upload the
file and validate it
one more time. Okay.
This
Then we have only a
single error. And
that has to do with
character encoding,
which we're going to talk
talk about in the next section.
section
So this is all about
about HTML.
validation.
Now
For CSS,
we
we
have a different value.
have validator.
So we go to
Jigsaw
.w.org
//
CSS.
validator.
Now you don't have
To memorize this address,
to
simply go to Google
and search for
CSS.
validator. Here's the first link.
So we have the same interface.
Interface
We can validate our
CSS code
using an address
or
by file upload
or direct
input.
Now in this case,
We have embedded
put all of our CSS
CSS code
inside our
HTML markup.
But as our web
Pages get more
complex,
we want to separate
our CSS code
into separate
files
so our code is
better organized.
We'll talk about
About this in more detail.
in the future.
So for now,
I'm going to
copy
all of our
CSS code and then
go to the third tab, paste it over here, and validate. So we don't
have any errors.
Everything is perfect. So this is all about
Validation.
validation is very
Important.
If your web pages
Aren't displayed
as
as
expected,
always start
with a quick validation,
because
this can often point
points you in the right
direction.
Right, that brings us
Close to the end of this section.
in the
Next section,
we're going to explore
HTML in more
detail. We're going to
continue our web
development journey
and explore
explore HTML
in
in.
more detail.
So in this section,
Section, we're going to cover
cover the essential
HTML
elements you need
to
to
know to build web
pages.
You will learn
All the elements used
for displaying
text,
links, images,
pages, lists,
tables,
as well
plus container
and structural
or semantic.
semantic elements.
Even if you know
Know the basics of it.
HTML,
I would still encourage
you
you
to watch this section
section thoroughly.
because a lot of
People don't use it
these elements the
the right way.
So let's jump
Pain and get started.
started. Earlier,
In the course, I
I told you that we use the head
had section
to give browsers
and search engines
information.
about a web page.
So
Let's
let's
explore it in a bit.
more detail.
I'm going to start
Start with a blank document.
document,
Now let me show you a cool trick.
trait,
If we type
an exclamation,
mark and then
and press tab,
we get a
basic
HTML boilerplate,
HTML, which means
a basic
HTML template.
plate.
So on the top,
We have our
doc type declaration.
action,
Below that, we have
our HTML element,
element with the lamp,
blank attribute,
which is a common best.
practice,
Next, we have
our head section,
with a bunch of
elements we're going to
talk about in a second,
again,
followed by the body.
body section,
So this is a very basic
basic
HTML boiler.
plate.
Now, what do we have?
In the head section,
Well,
we have a couple of
Meta elements,
for giving
information about this.
web page.
The first
Meta
meta
element is
for defining the
character set.
what is a
Character set.
Well,
computers don't
understand character,
characters like A, B.
PC, and so on.
They
Only understand numbers
numbers which are
represented in
the binary
format, zero.
zeros and ones.
So using a
Character set
we can map
map a character
there to a new.
numeric value.
The
This
first
character set that
was designed was the
ASCII character set,
set,
which is short for American
American Standard Code
Code for
Information Interchange.
Information. ASCII
ASCII can only
represent the
characters in the English,
English language.
so it's very limited.
So
over here,
different character sets
sets have been created
to represent
present more
characters in
international.
languages.
The character
Set that we use most
of the time these days,
is UTF,
CF8,
which can represent
almost all
characters in the world.
world.
So back to our code.
Code with-
This meta element
We're defining
finding the character set
set used
in this HTML.
in a document.
Okay.
Now,
below that we have
Have
a meta element
for
configuring the viewport.
Viewport.
The viewport
is a visible
is the area of a
web page.
so it
This
is
is this area over
here.
Obviously,
On a mobile device,
or on a tablet,
our viewport.
port is smaller.
But here
On desktop,
we can change
the
the
size of the viewport
viewport by
resizing the browser.
browser.
So now,
Our viewport is smaller.
okay,
Now back to our
code.
With this,
Element,
we're defining the
initial width,
and
zoom.
zoom factor
For the-
viewport.
We'll talk about this
In more detail in the
future.
For now,
What I want you to know is
is that we need this
element
so our web pages
just look good on
all devices,
mobiles,
tablets, and
desktop computers.
computers. So
As a best practice,
every web
page should have
have at least
these two meta elements.
elements. But
We have additional.
meta elements.
Let me show you.
So if
We
we
type
meta,
in this list
you can see all possible
possible meta elements.
elements.
For example, we have this
Element
for defining keyword.
words on a web page.
So
Let's select this.
here we
You can type multiple
keywords like
like HTML,
comma.
CSS, and so on. In the past,
These keywords were
heavily used for
search engine
optimization.
but these days
Most search
search engines don't put
too much weight
on these keywords.
but we can still
We use them to define
define the keywords
that represent
on this page.
We
We have another meta
element for
defining a
description for this.
page,
So if you type meta
colon,
desk and then
press tab, or
enter,
here we can type a
description
for this page.
what we type here
Here will
appear on Google
Google or other
search engines
when someone
searches for our website.
site.
For example, if
we search for apple,
well,
here's what we get.
now look at this text. What you see here comes
From this element over here. So this is the purpose
of meta elements.
With this
Meta elements,
we can give
information about
a web page.
All right, next
we're going to talk about the
elements you need to
know for working
with text.
All right, now let's talk
about the most
common elements for
working with text.
So
you learn about the
P or
paragraph element,
which we use for
displaying some text. So here I'm going to say,
I love
to teach you
HTML. Now sometimes we want to
emphasize a
part of our text.
Let's say
the HTML
word here.
To do that,
we can wrap it
inside
an M
or emphasis element.
So
here I type
M, press
tab.
Here's the emphasis element.
Let's
hover over it
and see what the
tooltip says.
It says
the M element
represents
stress
emphasis of its
content.
So whenever we want
to emphasize some
content,
we can wrap it
inside the
M element.
So in this case,
I'm going to move
HTML
inside
these tags. Now, let's save
the changes. Here's what we get.
So by
default,
browsers display
emphasized
content
in italic.
But don't assume
that whenever you want
to display italic
content,
you should use the M element.
Because
the purpose of the
M element
is to emphasize
content
in our HTML
document.
And this helps search
engines
extract important
content in our
documents.
Anything to do with
styling should
be done in CSS.
For example,
here we can change
the default
style of
emphasized element
and remove
the italic.
Let me show you.
So in
the head section,
we add the style element,
and here we
define a rule
for emphasized
content.
We can
set the color to
red
and font
style
to normal.
Now,
don't worry about memorizing
any of these CSS
properties.
We're going to go over
them multiple
times throughout the course. But let's see what happens now that we apply these
styles.
So
our emphasized
content
is displayed in red
and it's no longer
italic.
Now,
in the past we had
an element called
I,
which was
short for italic. If we use this
element, we get the same result
as before.
Our content
is displayed in
italic.
But this
element is considered
deprecated
because
HTML is not
meant for styling.
It should only
be used for
structuring content. So don't use the
I element to
display content
as italic.
Okay?
Now we have a
similar element in
HTML called
strong. Let's hover over it
and see
what the tooltip says. The strong element
represents
strong importance, seriousness, or
urgency of its contents. Conceptually, it's
kind of similar
to the emphasis
element.
So where you
should use it
really depends on your
context.
On your content.
Now let's save the
changes and see
what we get. So by default,
strong
elements are displayed
as bold.
But once again,
we can
always change the styling. Now in the past, we had
another element
called B, which is short for bold.
So
whenever we wanted to make something
bold,
we use this element.
But
once again, this
element is considered
deprecated
because
styling should be done in
CSS
and not in HTML.
Okay?
So
don't use B
or I elements. Now I'm going to
remove
this element and just add HTML.
Let me show you
a cool trick.
Let's say we want to
wrap this word
with the M
element. There is
a shortcut for it.
So
on the top,
we go to the
view menu.
Look at
the shortcut for
the command palette.
On Mac
is Shift,
Command and P.
And on Windows
is probably
Shift, Control
and P.
So let's
select HTML
and then
bring up the command
palette.
With this command
palette, we can
execute commands
in VS Code.
So here I'm going to
search for a command
called wrap
with abbreviation. That is the first command
on the list.
Now we press
enter.
And here we type
the element that
we want to use to
wrap our
selected content.
In this case,
M.
Press
enter. Done.
So
I didn't have to manually
create an
M element
and then move HTML
inside it.
It's very handy. So this is all about
text.
Now let's talk about
headings.
So in
HTML we have
6 heading
elements.
H1.
We have
H2.
H3. H4. H5. And
H6. So
let's see what we get.
So
heading 1 represents the most important
heading.
And heading 6
represents
the least important
heading.
Now one common
mistake that I see
amongst a lot of people is that they choose these
headings
based on their size. So if they want to have
a heading
with this size,
they would
just use heading 4.
That is
not how you're supposed
to use headings.
Because the
Size
size
can always
be changed with CSS,
assess.
it's a matter of style.
Styling.
We should use these headings
To create a
hierarchy.
so every
Web page should have
have one
and only one
H1
element.
This heading represents
That's what this
page is all about.
about. Now,
Nothing happens if
we have multiple
H1 elements.
For example, I can duplicate
Duplicate this line.
and say
Heading 1.
plus.
Now look,
We have
2 H1 elements.
but this
It's going to confuse search.
engines
They're not going to figure
figure out what this
page is really
all
all.
about.
So every page,
Should have a
single
H1 element.
element.
So
I'm going to remove this.
this line.
Now,
After we use H1,
then we should
use H2.
not jump.
Jump to H4.
So
Let's say on this page,
we're going to have 2 sections.
sections. One,
For HTML,
the other for
CSS.
So my
This
next
heading should be H2.
2,
And here we can type.
HTML. Obviously,
Below this heading, we
we
can.
can have some text.
So
I'm going to say
HTML
tutorial. Our next heading
should
should
be H2.
so this is the
The
CSS,
section.
and in this
Section, we can have some,
additional text
let's say,
is CSS tutorial.
tutorial.
Now I'm going to
Delete
these.
4 headings.
So
Oh.
let's take a look.
So
We have a hierarchy.
on the top,
We have an H1 element.
below
Below that we have
2 H.
H2 elements.
Now let's say
In this section,
we're going to have
2 subsections.
sections. There,
There we should use.
H3 elements. So
Here's our HTML.
HTML section.
In
This
this
section, we're going to have
have 2,
H3 elements.
let's say,
Code,
and
exercise. Now take a look. So
we have a hierarchy.
this is
How we should use these.
the heading elements.
The
Better we can represent
the structure of
our document using
HTML,
the better
search engines can read
read and understand.
our content. So that's all about text.
Next,
We're going to talk about
displaying
special characters.
in HTML. Some characters
Characters are reserved,
in HTML,
and to display
them we have to use
a special.
notation.
For example,
Let's say we
I'm
want
going to wrap the word
HTML
with angle bracket.
brackets.
See what's going to happen.
So I type
A left
the angle bracket,
and
a right.
angle bracket.
See what happened?
We are
This code thought we're adding
adding an HTML element.
element, so
It automatically
generated.
the closing tag.
We don't want
This, so let's
delete it.
now
Back in the browser.
look,
Where's our HTML?
word.
It's not here.
Because the browser
Browser
interpreted this
as an.
HTML tag.
This is not
What we want. We want
to
it
display this.
exactly as.
This
So to solve this,
problem
we're going to use HTML.
HTML entities.
All these
Entities start
with an ampersand
percent
and end with a semicolon.
semicolon.
In between these two,
The characters
we type a few characters
that
determine the
type of the HTML.
HTML entity.
So we have
An entity,
for displaying
the
the
less than sign.
That
That is L,
T
short for less.
than.
Now let's
Remove this.
similarly
We have
another HTML
entity
for displaying the
greater than sign.
So we type
An ampersand,
GT
T, which is short
for greater than
followed
by a semicolon.
now
Back to the
browser
That's exactly
what we wanted. Perfect.
perfect.
Another common
HTML entity
is the copyright.
right symbol.
So at the end,
I'm going to type an
ampersand
copy
and a semicolon.
colon
Now take a look. Here's our copyright.
symbol. Beautiful.
That-
We have so many
It
entities
is in HTML.
and quite
Frankly, you don't need
need to memorize it.
any of them. In fact,
You're not going to use
99%.
of them.
But in case you're curious,
Yes. Let me show
here's
you.
the complete list.
So
On Google,
search for
HTML entities. And
on this
second link,
dev.org,
w3.org, you can see the complete
complete list of these entities.
entities.
So as you
You
can
can see the
there are so many entities.
entities, and
Honestly, I have
I've never used any of them.
them.
The only ones I have
used are
these 3
plus
non-breaking space.
space. Let me show you.
What that is about.
So
I'm going to delete this line and generate
some dummy text.
so
We add a paragraph element.
Now-
To generate some,
dummy text.
we type lorem
Lorem.
followed by the number
What words we want to
generate. Let's
say 50.
tab. Look,
This is some
dummy text.
in Latin.
Now,
Let's preview it in the browser.
browser.
So here's
Here's what we get.
let's imagine
Imagine that
the last word
on
on
the first line,
and the
first word on the
second line should
be stick together.
here we have
A
a
line break
in
in
between these two words.
words. You
To
want
prevent that,
so
I'm going to copy
copy this word.
now
Here-
in VS Code
Let's bring up the
search panel by
pressing Command
and F on Mac,
Mac or
Control and F on Windows.
Windows.
Now we paste.
This word,
Okay, here
here it is,
we want to make sure
that these two
words are
always together.
There's no
line break in between.
in there.
So I'm going
I'm
to
going to replace
this regular space
space with
a
a
non-breaking
space, which is an
HTML entity.
so we
Type an ampersand
percent
NBS,
SP,
which
which
is short for
non-breaking
space.
followed by semicolon. Now take a look. So
Both these
words
are on the second line. So this is all about
HTML entities.
Next, we're
We're
going
going to talk about links.
to
Almost
every web page
on
on
the internet has
links to other
pages or websites.
sites. To
Create these links
we use the anchor
per element
So we type A
that is short
for anchor.
and then press tab. Now every anchor
Element should have
an href
attribute.
href
Is short for
hypertext reference.
hypertext. I know.
It's a mouthful,
It basically means
a URL.
or a link.
So for this
Demo, I'm going to create
a second page
called
about.html
and then link.
to it over here.
So
Here in
for
Explorer,
a panel, let's add
a new page
called
about
about.html.
now here
I'm
we
going to create a basic
basic HTML.
boilerplate.
Remember,
How to do that?
we type an
Exclamation mark.
and then press tab.
That's
That's it. Beautiful.
Now,
Now back to index.html.
HTML.
Here we
Can
can
use a relative
save or an
absolute URL.
URL. What do you mean?
By that? Well,
A relative
relative URL
starts.
from the current page.
So currently
We are on index.html
HTML
and we want to go
go
to
to about.html.
HTML.
Now currently
See, both these pages
pages are in the same
folder.
So
We can type a
relative URL
to about
.html like
this. About
about.html.
HTML.
That's a relative.
URL.
Now what if about
About.html
was in a different folder?
folder. So let's add
A new folder to our
project
called company
company
and then move to
about
this folder.
folder.
Now where is
About.html
relative?
to the current page.
It's in
Inside the company
folder, right?
So
Here we type
company
slash
about.html. This is a relative.
URL.
Now
Let's
let's
give this link a text.
text
I'm going to say about.
me
So we type our text
inside the
anchor element. Okay.
okay.
Save the changes
Back
to
to
the browser.
here's our link
Click.
and
We're currently on the about
about page, which is empty.
empty. Beautiful. Now back to
Our
our,
home page.
instead of a
Text we can also use.
use an image.
So I'm going to delete
Delete about
me,
and
add an
image
image.
element.
So IMG tab.
Once again,
Again, here we can type
a relative URL
URL to our target.
image
So I'm going to go
with images
slash
mosh that
JPG.
now save.
Back to our code.
To keep things,
Things simple.
I'm going to get rid of
This image and
and
get back
to our text
about me. Now let's go to the about page.
page and
Add a link back to
the home page.
so
Over here,
here
we're going to add an anchor element.
and
What should we type
for the href
attribute?
well,
Currently we are in
inside the company
folder
we have to go one
level up
so we can access
index.html.
right?
To do that, we
Type double
periods
and a forward slash.
with this
This we can go one
level up,
Now at this level
which is the root of.
of our website,
We have the company
folder, the image
images folder,
and index.html.
HTML.
So we can reference
index,
.html
and
for the text
I'm
room
going to say
homepage.
again
This is another
example of a
relative URL
because it starts
from the current page
and goes.
somewhere else.
Now if you're inside
Inside a deep
nested,
folder structure,
we might have to
go multiple levels.
close up.
So double period
Period and a forward slash.
slash
Then we repeat.
and repeat
With this, we can go
3 levels up.
Now-
As you can see,
URLs like this.
kind of look messy,
See, they look
hard to read.
in those cases
Says we can use an
absolute URL.
so
Nope. We
start
with forward slash
and this
represents the
root of our website.
Now
At this level we have
access to index.html
HTML. So this is an absolute
URL.
back to index.html.
No.
Here
We're
we're
linking to an HTML
HTML document text.
with 200 words.
So
Paragraph
lorem
200.
Now right after that,
We're going to add
another H2
for the CSS
CSS section,
with some.
more text. Okay,
Let's
save the changes.
take a look.
Look,
As you can see,
the CSS
section
is below the font.
bold. So we have to
Scroll down to see.
What?
What we can do here,
is
on the top, we
we can add a link
to the CSS section.
So when the user
User clicks on that,
they will immediately
immediately jump to the CSS.
CSS section.
That is very easy. So here's the CSS.
Section.
First, we have to give this
This element a
unique identifier.
just
Just like everyone in the
real word can have a unique
unique identifier,
like a driver's
license, or
a password
every element
element on a page can
also have a
be unique identifier.
identifier.
So here I'm going to
Set the ID
the attribute to
CSS.
CSS
or we can use
a more descriptive
name like
section
dash.
CSS. The name
Doesn't really matter here. What matters is that
we're defining
what is called
a fragment
or a place
on this page.
Now,
we're going to add a
link to this fragment.
So,
on the top,
let's add
another anchor
element.
Now, for the
href,
we're going to type
a pound sign
followed
by the name of our
fragment, which
is section
dash CSS. And for the text,
we're going to say CSS. Now,
back to the browser.
Take a look.
I'm going to click on
this.
We immediately jump
to the CSS section.
Beautiful.
Now,
other websites like this
also have
a link that
helps you jump to
the top of the page.
Let's see how
you can create that. So after the
CSS section,
I'm going to add another anchor element. Now for the href, I'm going to use
an
empty fragment. So
we just type a
pound sign
without an identifier. And then we say
jump
to top. Take a look.
So
here's
our link.
Click, and
now we're on top of the
page.
Now let's see how we can
link to external
websites. So let's add
another anchor element
to link to Google.
Now what should we type here?
Well,
google.com
is a different website.
So here
we cannot use
a relative URL.
We have to use
an absolute URL.
But if
you start with a
forward slash,
we're referencing
the root of our
website.
But in this case,
we want to go to a
different website.
How can we do that?
Well,
we have to start
with the protocol.
So
HTTPS
://
google.com.
Now let's type Google and test our
page. Click.
We're on Google.
Beautiful.
Now sometimes
when linking
to external
websites,
we want that link to
open in a new
browser window
or a new tab.
Let me show you how to
do that.
So
here's our anchor. We set the target
attribute to
underline
blank.
Say.
Okay.
Now,
back to the home
page.
Once again, we have to manually
refresh
to get the latest changes. Okay.
Now,
when I click on
Google,
you see a new tab.
Beautiful.
And
one last thing.
We can
also link to emails. So I'm going to add an anchor. And for href,
I'm going to say
mail to
programming
with
mosh@gmail.com. Email me. Save the changes. Now,
back to our page.
When I
click on this link,
my mail client
will open
and my email
address will be
pre-populated.
Take a look.
So click.
And
here's my mail client. So this is all about
links.
Now one last thing before
we finish this lesson. What is the difference between
a link and a hyperlink?
Well,
a link is
just an address,
a URL,
the location of the
target page.
A hyperlink
is the
element that the user can
click on to
navigate to that
target page.
That is the difference
between a link
and a hyperlink.
But quite often,
these terms are used
interchangeably. All right, we're done with this
lesson. Next,
we're going to talk about
images.
All right,
now let's talk about
embedding images
in a bit more detail.
For this
lesson, I'm going to grab
an image from
unsplash.com,
which is
where we can find
a lot of beautiful
and freely
usable images. So let's search for
coffee. There are
tons of coffee
pictures here.
I'm going to grab this picture. We can download it
for free.
Now look,
this image
comes in different sizes.
Small,
medium,
and large.
For now, we're going to grab
this image in a
small size.
But in the future, we're going
to talk about
embedding images
at different
sizes
depending on the device.
So
on mobile devices,
we want to serve
a smaller
image. And
on desktop computers,
we want to serve
a larger image. For now, let's not worry about
this complexity.
We'll have
a complete section
on this topic
later on.
So
let's download the small
image. Now it says,
say thank
you to Nathan.
Thanks, Nathan.
This is a
beautiful picture.
You've done a great job.
Now
I'm going to drag and
drop this image
onto the
images folder. And then rename
it to coffee. We want to give it a descriptive
name. This is
a small search
engine optimization
tip.
When we provide
descriptive names
for our images,
search engines
can better understand
and
index our pages.
Okay.
So
here's our image.
Now let's add an image
element.
We set the
source to images
/
coffee.jpg. Now,
what about the auth
attribute?
Well, I briefly
mentioned that
we use this attribute
to provide
a textual
description of the image.
It's not
compulsory,
but is highly recommended
for
a number of reasons.
The first reason
is to make our
page accessible
to visually
impaired people.
These
people use a
screen reader
to read the web
out to them.
So with this
alternative text,
we can tell them what
we are showing on the page.
page. And
That
that
means we should
write a good
meaningful
in
description,
here, like
a coffee mug
mug.
on a table.
Don't
Write something like
image or image
one that is
pointless.
Now the second
Benefit of providing
an alternative
text
is
is
that we help
search engines
read this text
text and understand
understand what we're
providing here.
and there's
One
one.
more benefit.
If this
Image cannot be
loaded for some reason,
reason
alternative text is
shown.
Let me show you what I mean.
So
I'm going to add a typo
here.
Now,
Back
through
to
browser, look,
the
image is not loaded,
but we see
the alternative text.
this can
Also happen
if there is a network.
a connectivity issue.
If the user
User gets disconnected,
they can still see
see the alternative.
text.
So
Let's remove the typo.
now
Let's talk about size.
sizing images.
As I told you before,
We can use
CSS
to resize our images.
So
Here in the head section,
Yeah.
let's add
a style
element,
and apply.
a rule to our image.
Now this rule is
Applied to
all
all
images on the page.
page. This is
Probably not something
we want to do in the real
world scenario.
in a real
What scenario?
we want to apply
A class
to this element
and then define
rules for that class.
class.
We'll talk about this in
More detail in the future.
future.
So for now,
Let's give
this
this
image a
width of
200 pixels
and a height
of 200.
pixels
Now, there's a tiny problem.
in our image.
Can you tell? Our image is kind of squashed.
Washed.
Here's the reason.
We're dealing with
With a rectangular
image,
look, this is
the rectangular image,
but we're
converting it
to a square image.
image. Now look
Look at the shape of this.
coffee mug,
It's kind of round,
right?
like compared with
With
what we have over here.
our image
It's vertically
squashed.
Let me show you another way.
To verify this,
We
you can right click on the image and then go to
Inspect. This opens
Chrome DevTools and
and selects our.
our image in the DOM.
Now,
On the right side,
we can see the
styles that we
apply to this element.
element.
Now I'm going to
Disable the height,
property
and I want you
to pay close attention
attention to the image and
see how the shape.
shape changes.
So look,
Now the coffee mug,
mug is more round.
but if I
Apply the height property,
apply
it becomes squash.
squashed
So how can we solve this
problem,
We have a
new
new
property in CSS,
process called
object fit. So here we can set
object
fit
to one of these values.
most of
The
the
time we use cover,
cover
so the image
covers its
containing box.
What is this?
Containing box.
Well,
First, let me set this.
to cover,
Here we
we
have
have
this image element. Right?
right.
Conceptually,
There
there's
is a box
around every
element in an HTML.
HTML document.
We don't see
This box
but the browser
uses that box
to figure out
how the page
should be displayed.
So here
We
we
have a box with this
dimension
200 by 200,
100.
and in this box,
We're trying to
insert this image.
image, right?
Now, when we
We set object fit.
fit to cover,
Our image
we'll get
resized and
potentially cropped,
so it
covers the
entire containing.
box.
Let's verify this.
So
Save the changes.
and back in the browser,
Look.
our coffee mug is
It's round.
but if I disable
Well, the object fit
property, it gets squashed again. So object fit is a
very useful property.
property.
Now we can always
Play with
all possible values.
values over here.
So
I'm going to select this,
Delete.
delete it,
now using the
up and down.
arrows
We can go through
for this list,
and see the
impact of every.
value.
Now I'm not going to go over
Where all these values
those and explain what
they mean.
this is pointless.
You can always figure
Come
that
out on your own.
Just remember
That most of the time we use cover.
cover. So the
Image covers
the entire content.
containing box.
All right, this is
It's all about images.
for now. Next,
We're going to talk about
video and audio. Hey guys,
Mosh here.
I just wanted to let you know
That this video
you've been watching
is the first hour
of my Ultimate
ultimate HTML
and CSS series.
So
After you watch this,
video,
if you want to learn more from
me, you can enroll,
in the full course,
which is about
13 hours long,
and covers
everything you need to know
to build
professional quality
the website with
HTML and CSS.
CSS.
It also includes
Summary notes,
notes, exercise,
sizes, a
real project
a certificate
of completion you can
add to your resume,
and a 30-day
30-day money back,
guarantee to
get
get
a refund if
you're
you're.
not satisfied.
So you have
Nothing to lose.
and a lot to learn.
So if you're interested,
I put the
link in the description
box.